Welcome to the Lantern Cinema Podcast, part of a film society for the initiated, people who love to discuss cult, revival, classic films, and film history. Today we'll be discussing Jean Luc Goddard's Breathless. I am your host, Chris B. Genie, and joining me, as always, Hannah and Dustin Harmson.
Woo! Hello! Inaugural episode! Inaugural.
Which means first.
Which means first, which is actually apropos, because today we're talking about Jean Luc Goddard's first film, first feature.
Yeah.
Before we do that, we should probably talk a little bit about what it is that we're doing and why we are doing this.
Mm-hmm. You're looking at me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we started the Lantern as a film society. That's what we call it because it encompasses a lot of different things. It is kind of just coming from the experience that I had where I just love watching movies with people. And when I really started getting into movies, I wanted to watch them with others. I feel like that's really integral to having a good experience watching a movie, especially for the first time. So we do screenings of the Vaudeville Muse right now, monthly. It's, like Chris mentioned, it's all cult, revival, classic films. We do a little bit of everything, sometimes with a theme, sometimes not. We have pre-show talks. We have some great posters around town with some local artists with the help from Kenny Halstead putting those together.
And we've had the most, not to toot our horns, but our horns will be tooted. We've had the most amazing first year. I keep meaning to go and post on our various social media outlets, just the roll call of all of the amazing films that we've done. Mm-hmm. And I won't be able to do justice to it now by naming all of them, but we can kind of just start calling them out a little bit. We started off with Easy Rider. We did Eraserhead,
then Bottle Rocket,
Putney Swope.
Then we had a break for a month.
Yeah, we don't need to do an order. We can just kind of start doing it. We've done There Will Be Blood. We've done Royal Tenenbaums.
King of Comedy.
Lost in Translation.
Bicycle Thieves.
That's
the oldest film we've done so far.
Right.
And we have one coming up on August 30th that we're very excited about. It's a classic movie. If you have not seen a John Cassavetes film, this is the place to start. A name often heard, but not always seen. And especially as films, maybe not seen in a public forum very often. We're talking about John Cassavetes' Killing of a Chinese Bookie, and that's going to be incredible.
So if you're interested, August 30th, Vaudeville Muse. We actually have a short film by a local filmmaker starting off at 6:30.
Will Foley.
Start finishing up with that John Cassavetes picture. So please do check it out. It's really, really great. And if you don't know John Cassavetes, he's just the sexy man who made movies with his sexy wife, and they're amazing.
And this will be kind of a good segue into getting into our conversation about Breathless today. John Cassavetes is kind of the United States version of the ultimate independent filmmaker. Mm-hmm. And some might even argue the number one independent filmmaker of all time. And I recently saw an interview with him where actually the YouTube thing was called A Filmmaker Ranting. And that's pretty much what it was, but it was awesome. He was just like Hannah said, very sexy, whatever. He's just a very intense looking, handsome man.
Good looking Greek man. He was an actor, very successful actor.
Rosemary's Baby.
Rosemary's Baby funneled all that money that he made acting into he was so passionate about making films that he funneled that money into his directorial pieces.
Essentially, he would make money commercially as an actor, being on different TV shows and things like that. And then what he would do is, like she said, funnel that money into making his own amazing films. And in this particular kind of ranting piece, he's looking right at the camera. You can't see me for the people listening right now, but his hands are flailing all over the place. And he's just people, Hollywood needs to grow up. I'm tired of seeing this crap. I don't want to see it anymore. When people come to see my movies, I don't even care if you like it. I just want you to know that you've seen something that you've never seen before. And I think Breathless is a perfect example of kind of a similar idea.
This is the 1960 version of that.
Yeah, that same kind of energy and passion being funneled in a very exciting way. So maybe we can talk a little bit about how we saw this for the first time together.
Yeah, so we've mentioned Lantern Cinema is a film society, and I think we're taking more steps toward defining what that is for us, and we have these monthly screenings, now we have a podcast, and prepping for this, the three of us, and friend of the show, Claire
Anderson, not to name drop, Claire Anderson.
We watched this movie on your deck in your backyard, basically, and it was amazing.
Yeah.
Like, you guys have a projector set up. We had the popcorn cracked out that we normally use for the screenings at the Muse, so it was very much like we're going to the movies, but it's in a backyard, and it was amazing.
It was really nice.
I'd like to add that's actually, if we're talking about the roots of the lantern,
yes.
That's it.
That's it.
Because back at our old house, we used to live over in 4 Mile Creek area. We had, there's kind of this joke we have about living on the east side where you can basically do whatever you want.
We still probably live on the east side for the same reason.
We had go-karts in the backyard of that house. We used to play, we used to bring the projector out and play video games on the screen outside. And one thing we did was actually show movies in our sunroomer in the backyard, and that was, we called it, what did we even call it? Film nights?
We used to have Art House Thursdays.
Art House Thursdays, yeah. And so roughly every Thursday we would just show movies on the projector with friends. Everyone would bring wine and snacks, and it was really, really fun. And so that's what kind of morphed into the lantern.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I didn't even know that. And
Yeah.
I've been doing this with you guys for a year.
And this is how that worked. We actually went to the store. We bought as big of a king size sheet.
Yep.
And we had all of this paneling.
Stapled it to our,
I don't know what.
Cubicle walls.
Cubicle walls. We put it up on the wall, put this big screen, and the first movie we screened, do you know what it was? This isn't very art house, but this is the first one we did. The first one we did, we invited Elliot Imes and a few of our other kind of local buddies, and we watched Nightmare on Elm Street. It was amazing, though.
Yep. Yeah, I can remember that.
And even at that early stage, of course, we looked incredibly pretentious. We didn't care. We would invite our friends over and we would screen La Strada or Modern Times, and we would do a pre-show talk ourselves. Mm-hmm. And all of our friends were kind of embarrassed for us. But who's embarrassed now?
Everybody still is.
So we're just.
But now there's more
nuts.
of them.
Yeah, we're just film nuts. That's all it comes down to. We're really excited about this. So let's jump right in. Breathless. So, Chris, what was some of your initial thoughts going into it? Had you known much about the movie itself?
For me, I hadn't. For everybody else, this was my first time seeing Breathless. Both of you guys have seen it, I believe, multiple times. But this was me going into a movie pretty much blind, which I don't get to do very often, but I appreciate when I can do that, where I know the title, maybe a couple people that are in it, and that's kind of it, and you just go. And as long as it's not a horror movie, I know I'm safe going into it.
We'll have to trick you sometimes.
Oh, man.
No, I know.
It'll probably still happen.
Yeah.
But going into it, I just knew it was French New Wave, black and white, early 60s, just kind of different. And I didn't know what all of that meant at the time. But now, having let that viewing permeate for a week and just be reading up on things and people and backgrounds, I get it a bit more. But I was blown away by the movie. I don't know that I had lost my breath while watching it, but close.
Yeah.
Because it was fantastic.
It seems like on the on our Twitter page, I've definitely posted a lot of images and GIFs and whatnot from Breathless, and it seems to be anytime I do something from Breathless, you will definitely get people interested or retweeting it. So there's certainly something about the film Breathless that kind of anyone who's into movies or wants to get into the fancier kind of arty movies, Breathless seems to be one that a lot of people kind of know about.
It felt like a nice, somewhat entry point for me, because I've seen some other films from around the time, but not as much as you two. And I guess even out of context, just seeing a screenshot or a GIF or something, you can look at it and tell, oh, hey, this is a little bit different than most of what's coming out in 2018, but it's not really out there. It's not super bizarre. There's not crazy dreams or anything.
Yeah,
it's
totally.
not maybe as difficult as a first sitting as 8.5 might be for some people, since it does get a little crazier and it's also just longer. Yeah. Where here is a movie that at the time was modern. You see the city and stuff. There's not a lot that's really wacky. It is mostly a down-to-earth story, and maybe parts of how they tell it are exaggerated and different, but just looking at it out of context, it looks like something you can just dive into, which it is.
Yes.
It's super accessible. There are a lot of film traits that I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about today that made it seem kind of wacky to people in 1960 that I think we're a little more used to now. But that's what I love about this one. With books, movies, everything, I just like good stories. And this absolutely falls into that category. So it's super accessible. It's stylish. I think before I'd even seen it, I knew who Jean Seberg was because of her haircut. And, obviously it goes deeper than a haircut, but it's good to look at. It's, like I said, it's stylish, it's iconic. I think it pulls people in, even if you're not necessarily into filmmaking. It's great.
It's got one of those qualities to it. Before we go any further, we should probably note that with the Lantern podcast, we did have a conversation of how much spoilers will be, and I think we kind of settled on spoilers will be had.
Yes, they will be happening.
We have to discuss, different plot points and maybe, talk about kind of what happened. So we would strongly encourage everybody that's listening to this podcast. At the end of our discussion with Breathless, we'll discuss what the next movie is going to be. And we would encourage you to watch the movie beforehand so we can all be in the club kind of together.
Well, before we deep dive, should we just give a nice little synopsis of what Breathless is about for anyone who hasn't seen it, so they at least can tell if they're interested, if they want to tune out for a little bit and not get spoiled?
And go see it. You should watch it. If you haven't seen it, go watch it. I think you'll appreciate everything we're about ready to divulge, if you've seen it now.
All right, take it, Crispy Genie.
You got
What's this movie about?
So for me, going in blind, what I had pieced together early on, because there are some parts that are slightly vague, it is basically about a guy on the run in a stolen car who thinks very, very highly of himself, and in the heat of a moment shoots a police officer.
Yes.
He's going to get pulled over for speeding because he's just being kind of an ass, and realizes, oh, hey, I'm in trouble, freaks out, and then that kind of sets up the rest of his arc for the movie, is being on the run, being someone with his name and face all over the papers and all over the place. And he has this girl, and that's kind of how I'll phrase it, because it seems like he has been with multiple women very frequently. But there's one particular young 20-year-old New Yorker hanging out in Paris selling... Was it Daily Herald or Herald Tribune? New York Herald Tribune papers.
New York Herald Tribune.
And she is the type that is like young and smart but lost and doesn't know what she wants to do and is constantly talking about thinking but not thinking about anything. And it's just kind of like hopeless romantic wandering through Paris trying to figure her life out. And he is a kleptomaniac and a very self-centered person. Yeah. And the rest of the movie is kind of this interesting relationship between the two of them and him taking advantage of her, but also feeling like he needs her.
He loves her.
He loves her. And she's wrestling whether she loves him and if not, and if it's the same way, and if she should just move on with her life because she is 20. So it just kind of tells this crazy, tumultuous romantic relationship in Paris with this guy on the run the entire time and seeing various interactions with the police, and then it ends in this big dramatic way.
Yes.
But it's mostly two hopeless romantics with very different messed up lives in Paris in 1960.
Yes, wow. That deserves a round of applause. That was a great synopsis. In this podcast, you will never hear me do a synopsis because I'm not good at that in any way. These two, Hannah and the Genie, will be the ones that are just nailing the yeah.
So if I can make that super concise in the words of Godard himself, when he spoke to Truffaut, who we'll also talk about, another filmmaker, he said, roughly speaking, the subject will be the story of a boy who thinks of death and a girl who doesn't.
Wow.
Yeah, which is really good. And also, sorry to bother you in theaters now. If you give it a really concise synopsis, that is also literally the synopsis.
Wow, that's interesting. Wow.
But I won't spoil that movie because it's new and it's really good.
So and I don't think you could. That movie is so amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure go see that. Anyways, yeah, another great thing to think about with this movie is oftentimes, I think we had kind of alluded to, this movie is kind of thought of as the entry point to the French New Wave, which is just this amazing trend that occurred in cinema in the 1960s. So maybe we could have a little bit of a synopsis of what the French New Wave is. Yeah.
Can I jump in for that? Yeah, so the 1950s and 60s, before that point, pretty much across the Western world, there was just kind of a formulaic idea of what a movie was. It had to look a certain way, sound a certain way, it was edited a certain way. And this was probably one of the bigger changes in filmmaking because it was essentially a group of critics and film buffs who were interested in film, they were reviewing films, and they wanted to see how it could change to better reflect specifically French life in that time period. So there are a lot of kind of trademarks for French New Wave, but ultimately the goal was just to capture real French life and defy film conventions. So you see a lot of changes in editing, you see a lot of changes in production style, how long it took to produce a film, things like that. And then, so really one quote I think that kind of encapsulates this idea that I think would be a good launching point here was in a short film made before Breathless, just before Breathless, Godard has a quote that was, cinema is truth 24 times per second.
What an amazing quote, too. Yeah, it's so awesome. And Jean Luc Goddard obviously was a part of this group of critics that, that they all became filmmakers.
Well,
the Young Turks. And Truffaut, Truffaut was another one, and two other gentlemen, but obviously Truffaut and Godard are the most famous of that. But essentially, what Godard was discussing during this time was he went into making films as a feature so unbelievably confident. This is somebody that he didn't think I wonder if I could make a movie. Guess what? He knew he could make a movie, and you know the movie he made? Breathless. And it's so interesting to think of somebody being so confident. He was discussing, I've seen different quotes from him when he was saying before he started to make films, he was already making films. He did not think of his film criticism as just I'm a critic for the Village Voice or something like that. In his criticism, he was basically already discussing, this is what this movie is, but guess what? It would be way better
if it was this.
So I can't really think of a modern example, but maybe it would be something like somebody who really liked YouTube videos, and they watched YouTube videos and then they wrote comments. But then as they're writing comments, they thought, you know what? I'm going to make YouTube way better. And then they made YouTube 3D or something like that.
Which we're all waiting for.
But, he was an absolute, kind of arrogant, kind of aggressive person. But guess what? He had the talent kind of to back it up. And all throughout Breathless, he did all kinds of interesting things. First off, Belmondo and Jean Seberg, the two protagonists.
Fantastic.
In the film, just amazing. But they kind of thought he was nuts. But
that would also make sense for the role he was playing. But what's funny to me is that reading more about Jean Seberg is that she had said that especially the movie she was in France, she never felt connected to those characters. Mm. But then learning more about her life, it's this seems like it was probably kind of like you.
Yeah, totally. Well, and it should also be noted that, kind of like you were saying, she was already making movies in France at that time. I'm sure we'll talk about Jean Seberg in a little bit more detail, but kind of loosely speaking, she is an Iowa native.
Mm-hmm.
Marshalltown. She was born in Marshalltown, and the movie that he actually saw her in.
Bonjour Tristesse.
Yeah, so that was a film that he had seen, which was made in France, and she was actually on the cover of the magazine that they wrote criticisms for.
He keeps gesturing me for the French part. So a lot of these new wave guys wrote for a magazine called Cahiers du Cinéma, which is where he saw Jean Seberg. And actually, there was a moment in the movie where a girl selling Cahiers du Cinema.
That's
kind of
hilarious.
Like the filmmaking.
Yeah. So, I mean, there you go. That's an example in real life kind of how it worked. Not only did he think he could make films, guess what he can? And I'm also going to take actresses from things that I've already been critiquing and put them in my own context. So throughout the filming of it, but another interesting point of Breathless that I saw was basically he didn't have like a full script written for it. Did you know that?
I just read that. Yeah. It was like 23 days of filming, something like that. And I read that they would shoot for like 15 minutes to 12 hours, depending on how he felt, like how creative he was feeling that day.
Could you imagine being on a set for 15 minutes?
Go home.
He thought it was like a complete waste of time though. Like the people that just like take after take and like spend so much of the crew's time.
Well, and he might be right sometimes. Like, at least for me, if I was in a really terrible mood right now, I wouldn't want to be recording this. It wouldn't be as good. I wouldn't be as comfortable. So if the film version of that, if there's just an actor that's not right, if he's not feeling right, like, why just hammer it for hours? Like, just come back tomorrow if you can. Mm-hmm. If you can afford to do that.
Yeah.
I think about Kenny, who does our posters. He was taking our pictures once, and I remember him saying, like, there was this point where everyone was tired, and he's like, we're not having fun, let's just stop. Like, if you're not having fun, go home. I think that's a really good policy for anything creative. If you're not having fun, just go home. It's not going to work.
And it seems like all the great kind of directors, and really anyone that's in any type of leadership position, always kind of has a similar mindset. So, but yeah, going back to him, talking about how he filmed this, he would basically be off set and he would like yell out the things for them to say. So I don't notice it as much in Breathless as I do in some kind of European art movies. But did you realize that that's one where they overdubbed the dialogue afterwards?
Oh,
it doesn't seem like it, does it?
No, I never would have really noticed that.
Yeah.
If you didn't mention it now.
Yeah, I read that and I was surprised.
Which I know is really common, and maybe it's harder to notice because they're not speaking our native language.
And thinking about it now, like, part of French New Wave is filming on site, being in the city. There had to be so much noise when they were doing that. Like, it seems like a requirement that they would have had to go back and do that with just traffic. Like, just those sounds and just city life would have probably just drowned out what they were trying to actually do. So that makes sense.
I also wonder, too, if it's because obviously as Americans or people... English speakers, we're having to read it because it is obviously subtitled. However, now that I think about it, the moments where Patricia is speaking English, it does seem a little kind of
slightly different.
Yeah, so maybe it's all it is just reading subtitles, I suppose. Dismissed.
Well, more notes on production that I took that are that point's kind of hilarious. So obviously, they must have shot it. They shot it overdubbed the dialogue later, which is really common. But they also did it with almost no lighting, which I thought was really interesting. So not only was it just shot on location, but they had almost no, big lighting production set up. The cinematographer didn't have a hard job in that way. Although his name, Raoul Coutard, was the cinematographer, had a difficult job in the sense that they didn't have a lot of the trappings of a normal big production. Instead of using a dolly and tracks for tracking shots. Dustin was noticing that. What are they?
They used a wheelchair.
Yes. He's pushing around a wheelchair. And then there's
the art of cinema.
I don't think you know this, but Coutard, who was, again, the cinematographer, would... so they had to set up these shots that were not... what's the word I'm looking for? They weren't like licensed. They didn't have permission to shoot in all these locations. Sure. They just did it. So they had him hiding in a postal bin, like with a camera following him around. So I love thinking of this, this timeless classic. And then to make it, they had this camera guy sitting in a bin being pushed around behind the main actor.
Well, I'm thinking about this too. It's interesting. She's talking about Godard, the person who was a cinematographer. Well, he obviously wasn't too freaked out by Godard because he stayed with him for like 20 years through 14 films. So it's pretty amazing how the relationship that they had. And then also thinking about it, we were talking about him in a wheelchair. That movie is so iconic, and you see all of the French people. And you do notice that in the background of Paris, there are moments where they're kind of like looking as like,
what's happening?
What the hell's going on? Is that a shot? What happened here? Anyways, Okay, so we can understand now why they might be looking kind of strange as someone is in just a little wheelchair getting pushed with a camera.
Yeah, it's different than like Batman being filmed in Chicago. The streets are closed and like everybody knows about it and is freaking out and like wants to try to like see things. Like they know what's there and they want to be a part of it versus, oh hey, there's a guy in a bin that's not supposed to be here. Are these people acting? What's happening? Like, very different scenario.
Maybe that's something too. It's like that makes the French New Wave so interesting is it's obviously pure. It was such a new idea at that point. Do you think movies are being made in the same way now in terms of, I'm sure that there's moments where there's kind of like, oh, is there a movie being filmed? But I bet that idea probably doesn't happen as naturally as
at least not as consistently, for sure.
Yeah. These people were... Godard, I believe, was someone who had a lot of experience in filming documentaries. So there's a sense of a documentary that comes through with the French New Wave as well. So really cool. Breathless for us wasn't our first French New Wave movie we had seen.
It wasn't our first Godard movie.
Is that right? Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, of course. Yeah. Our first Godard was Her Life to Live, which the French pronunciation is...
Vive sa vie.
Which is awesome. I love that movie so much. I think the first one we had seen, I was going to say it was 400 Blows, but I don't think it was. I think it was.
New Wave in general first.
Yeah, and I think this one might be questionable whether or not people will consider this New Wave. In my mind, I do. I think maybe mine was Last Year in Marienbad.
Oh, that's right. Okay, so...
Yeah.
But it seems like the dates for what is considered French New Wave also vary a bit, depending on who's looking at things. And for some people it started in 58, for others it like traces back to the late 40s-ish. So...
Yeah, one of the biggest names, Alain Resnais, is really attributed to the French New Wave, but I don't think he considered himself a French New Wave filmmaker. So I think there's a lot of flexibility there.
His movies seem quite a bit different too. He was completely into documentary, but also his movies, it seems like there's a lot of like still images. And I mean, Last Year in Marienbad is pretty much a movie without any peers. We should talk about it.
So the first one, we can talk about it for a second.
I love it.
Basically, it's the first French New Wave film we had seen. Was I guess Last Year in Marienbad, because he started getting into movies and Criterion Collection, whatever else. So you brought home Last Year in Marienbad, and I'm basically like, fuck you and your Last Year in Marienbad.
Dude, Last Year in Marienbad, check this out. The lead character, we'll get off this in a second. We should talk about it for a second.
It's just like if you're thinking of a pretentious movie,
that is it.
Like the names of the characters are X and Y.
And he loves it.
One character starts in forward, the other one starts in backwards. It's just a lot of French, like like talking as
the carpets. I don't know.
I love it. But we are fans of his movies as a whole. Actually, one of the movies that they talk about preceding Breathless.
Out of brief.
Hiroshima. Mon Amour, which is awesome, and also the 400 Blows, which we briefly had discussed with the Truffaut.
We saw Night and Fog, which was another.
Yeah. So another thing too, like you were talking about the script of Breathless. What also happened was Godard was the last of the Young Turks, of the people that were critiquing movies.
The youngest of the Turks, if you will.
The youngest of the Turks.
Yeah.
That was still probably young. Well,
still, yeah.
Because it sounds like most of the filmmakers around this time were born in the 30s and then making movies in like the late 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
So I can't imagine being my age and making that.
And Godard's still alive.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Isn't that crazy? That seems nuts to me.
Jean-Paul Belmondo.
Weird.
Very good-looking old man.
Is he? Oh,
Very
I haven't seen it. Wow, that's amazing. Well, anyways,
what we've gotten out of this so far is that Hannah is very fond of various filmmakers from the 60s, 80s. And whether it's Cassavetes or whatever, they're all just handsome French and Italian dudes.
I am objectifying men.
You need to look up, everyone at home, look up John Cassavetes.
Just take a look.
Just get
Okay, well, on that note, let's talk about Jean Seberg.
Yeah.
Because I know that...
Let's go ahead and give her a round of applause.
Okay.
Right now.
Okay. That was 10 people clapping, not just Dustin.
No, everyone at home is clapping right now.
But Chris I think, is kind of in love with Jean Seberg.
Yeah.
So I think we need to talk about her.
But part of it is reading about her life. So at this time, her character was 20. I believe in real life she was 22, still very similar. And I mentioned how there's like a quote from her from an interview being like, oh, I don't really connect with the characters I'm playing pretty much in France. And more of her films were in France than in the US, but a lot of both. And she moved around a bit. But in real life, she's someone who was divorced multiple times, had some relationships that had like periods of like puppy love and things going well, and then abuse and a complicated background. 2 children that she gave birth to that died within a week. One that actually got to grow up and have a life, but still this complicated, tragic person that was talented and amazing and politically active. And then her character in this movie is someone who's 20, someone who's lost, someone who is pregnant with a guy that's not actually a great dude. Even though they have moments where things are good, he's a mess. And spoilers, he dies in the end. So just there are little things that are threads to me that can tie into what her actual life was. Maybe not even at that time, but what it became. And then being someone who is politically active and giving money to the Black Panthers and various groups, being in a movie that has a lot of political and social commentary in France in 1960. It seems like even though nothing is black and white except for the actual movie, that there are still like things that relate to each other on screen versus her off-screen life and persona even. And I don't know, I feel like if I was around in 1960 and I saw her on screen, I would just be like immediately fawning over her. I would be like, okay, time to move to France and to be a terrible stalker and then regret everything and then move back.
One thing to me, especially as a lot, I mean, every time I've watched Breathless, since understanding more about Jean Seberg's history and backstory, the movie is strangely prophetic. Yeah. And in a way, when I see it, it kind of freaks me out a little bit. I mean, obviously, the iconic ending to the film with her just blankly staring at the camera, just head on, looking right at you, is it's downright ghostly.
Well, and then she like adopts his like main mannerism, his like little tick where he just like rubs his finger across his lips probably 15 times in this movie, and then she does it like right after he's dead, just staring at him.
It is really bizarre.
After being a key factor in his death.
Yeah.
It's really, I mean, does it freak you out? Like, does anyone else have that? I mean, you wouldn't have known all the Jean Seberg stuff
going into it, yeah.
Do you think about it when you see it?
I think with her, just in general, there's so much about her that just didn't seem to fit. And I don't mean in terms of talent as an actor or anything like that, but I think, in short, yes, I do agree with that. I think it's hard to watch any of her work without thinking about her personal life, because she was just someone who didn't really fit in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
I mean, she was never like the perfect, beautiful leading lady. That people rarely used her that way. She didn't quite fit in Marshalltown, Iowa. She never really felt super connected.
And then being like blacklisted in Hollywood, partially because of the CIA and all sorts of other like crazy stuff, or FBI, like doesn't get to be where she probably would have been best professionally, and then has to just live abroad and do other things and miss opportunities. And she's a very interesting background.
She fit in France in some ways.
Yeah.
There's some quotes about her not really feeling warmth from the French people. She missed Americans in that way. And I think, so when I see that ending, I think of how complicated her life was, for sure.
Even in the film, they briefly talk about other countries, because he's trying to tear her away to go to Italy. She doesn't know why most of the time, and it's just because he can go there and not get arrested. Mm-hmm. And she mentions like Mexico, being like, oh, I hear good things about that. And then in real life, she had a child with a Mexican man. Like, it's just like another weird little thing that happened later.
Well, and there's the scene in that, which this last time watching it outside, that I'd never noticed before. And someone might quote me or send an email saying what the quote was exactly, but it's something like, "You should die and then live on and become." Do you remember that? Like
from the interview scene?
No, from the interview. Like
she's asking him roughly like what your like greatest goal or desire is. It's a different word, but roughly those lines. She asked the question when she's interviewing this author, I believe, and he's kind of ignoring her the first few questions. Other people are asking stuff like, oh, hey, are women basically just here for sex? Like one guy kind of has that. And then eventually she kind of wins his favor a little bit, asks the question again, and he says his goal or his like top dream would be to be able to live forever and then die.
And go on, yeah. And at that moment, Jean Seberg, this is midway through.
Like to be immortal and then die.
To be immortal.
And then to die. Yeah.
And then that's one of the moments where she looks, it's kind of, I wonder if he did it, Godard did it intentionally, but she does look into the camera again.
Yeah, it's this moment where like that like really clicked with her. So then as a first time viewer, I was like, oh, what's going to happen now? Like, is she going to leave him? Like, what is this line going to mean for her?
Yeah, and why would breaking that fourth wall make that line so significant?
It's really powerful. And then, obviously it's making that point going back to her personal history.
Which, if we can be more explicit about, by the way, I think the best information I ever got about Jean Seberg was from another podcast. You Must Remember This did a whole series on Jean Seberg and Jane Fonda, Jean and Jane.
It was amazing.
Really worth listening to. But essentially, she's this girl who grew up in Marshalltown, really never fit in, had some kind of radical for the time political ideas from a young age. She moved to France. And eventually, like Chris mentioned, she was a big supporter of the Black Panthers. The FBI really targeted her strongly as a result, kind of ruined her career in a lot of ways, her life. She ends up having, like you mentioned, a baby who died, who, the biggest slander or libel against her. They kept saying that it wasn't her husband's child, it was a child of a Black Panther.
So for the funeral in Marshalltown, it was open casket.
Yeah.
So she could be like, oh, hey, look, this baby is white.
Which is horrifying. I mean, on so many levels. There's so many things to unpack with how awful this story is. And struggled with mental illness for a good portion of her life. Ultimately killed herself. And is remembered for a lot of those terrible things just as much as she is her work as an actor. Well, so when we keep referring to these tough things in her life, there's a lot to dig into.
It's a lot to unpack.
We actually, we saw Breathless and got really into it, and then we realized, like, we were watching the extras or whatever. They had a segment talking about Jean Seberg, and they said Marshalltown, Iowa, and we're like, what? She's from Iowa. And when we talk about people from Iowa, there's certainly people that come up a lot. Ashton Kutcher, the guy from Superman. But it's not. She's not mentioned that much. I feel like we should have, Jean Seberg.
There's a Jean Seberg festival
in Marshalltown,
right? Yeah, as we kind of discovered, there's a little bit more.
I wonder.
Like Ashton Kutcher.
Well, yeah. Like, I wonder if part of it is the way her life ended. Like, not having been someone who was even around then, because I was born in '90. Like, if it's like, oh, here's this person that we've just heard mostly bad things about, or like weird whispers and then court and stuff, like if that just surrounding her is like, oh, like this is just someone that we don't care about or hear about 30, 40 years later. We're like, Ashton Kutcher is still this good looking dude with this beautiful wife that just like makes mostly okay to bad things, but it's like around. And
I'm sure it is. Yeah, it's just an interesting thought to think why, she isn't more commonly discussed.
Well, I even think too about how European art films, I think, we as a society, we appreciate them and we like their style and everything else. But if I think about how many people want to see The Bicycle Thieves versus, something a little more relevant,
The Thing.
newer. Yeah, The Thing.
Yeah.
It's like I think it's a reflection of that too. I don't think it's necessarily a malintent type thing. It's
maybe even the stigma around suicide.
Absolutely.
It very well could be. Well, we're talking about European kind of art films. One thing that I always discuss that in my mind whenever we're talking about it, I think one thing that separates it, we're always looking at these movies through an American kind of context. And, American movies, if you look at like the classic Hollywood films, even looking at movies from 1960, man, there's a middle. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. They follow certain kind of editing rules. Like, it's very much like, and then this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. in European cinema, it is way less about story and a lot more about the psychological. And that's why you can get to the end of something like 8.5 or, any other European movie and you're like, okay, and that's the end. I just experienced that, but it leads to, a lot more analysis than it does just like the payoff of what a movie is. However, with Breathless, I feel like when it gets to the ending, it still to some degree speaks to the American context of how a movie should end.
Maybe part of that's seeing an American actor last. Like we see her face.
Yeah.
She's an American character, American actor.
Well, and I also saw
in a little bit.
I also saw this too. I had read that Godard, she's in an American in Paris whose close-ups and the poses that she makes actually makes up 20% of Breathless.
I would not have guessed that, but
so
thinking
Godard,
back,
he obviously loved her. There was some kind of quality that she possessed that he decided he was going to really make focus on her. Another thing that I read that was kind of interesting, Patricia in that movie is kind of the guardian of all of the French kind of histories. She's talking about Renoir. She's talking about all of the high culture kind of French things, whereas he's like this
crapping on him. He's like, that painting's not that good. This person's not great.
It's like gangster movies, like Humphrey Bogart, and that's interesting.
Yeah, and something else too I read is that Belmondo, in many ways, Michelle. Is it Michelle?
No, Michelle is the character. Jean-Paul Belmondo is the actor.
Okay, yeah. He is kind of a stand-in for Godard in a way. One thing I read that was really interesting is the movie begins with, let's interject Godard for a second as the Belmondo character. He takes over the American gangster genre right away. He's taking it over and he takes it hostage. And at the beginning, there's all that stuff where he's like looking at the camera, like talking.
There's a lot of fourth wall stuff from the first 5 minutes.
Yeah. And the idea being that Godard takes an American genre, the gangster film, and he's like, guess what? I'm going to do this, this, and this, and I'm going to throw this genre on its head. In a lot of ways, the movie's kind of like a comic book or something like that. Mm-hmm. There's... Bang, 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 bang.
Yeah, there are various moments that just kind of seem like panels of a comic, the way they're cut. I'm thinking part of the scenes with him driving in the beginning, and then they're on the street. Here's a guy walking. Here's a hard cut. That guy got hit by a car.
Yes.
It feels like you flipped the page and then saw that the person got run over.
And you can see bang in credits. Bang. Yeah.
You can imagine it anyway.
Yeah. Well, and something else too, they actually got to the end of the movie and he was really like, listen, I don't want to kill the main character. I just don't want that to happen. But this is a quote from him, and I did write the quote.
From Godard.
Yeah, from Godard himself. Finally, I decided that as my avowed vision was to make an ordinary gangster film, I had no business deliberately contradicting the genre. He must die.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, he's not the main character. Like, I would think if you had to pick one, Patricia.
I agree.
And she then doesn't die in the end. And it actually subverts your expectations, especially for being something older, where she is told, oh, hey, here's the story about this other young woman who had a kid, and it didn't end well for her, and she died. Mm-hmm. And you're told that early, and then immediately I was thinking, okay, she's going to have some sort of tragic ending. This is going to be terrible because she's amazing. And she doesn't die. Still doesn't have a great life for the rest of what's depicted on film. Still has her lover die in front of her, and then that clearly changes her immediately with the lip thing and just kind of the look that she has. So who knows what a sequel of this movie would have been like, just following the rest of her life.
He said in years later, this is an air quote, it's a really cool one. He now says the movie's actually more like Alice in Wonderland, where he was actually trying to make Scarface.
I like that too.
And it totally is. I mean, once again, going back to, he obviously loved Jean Seberg. There must have been something about that.
My main question that I kind of want to pose to you guys, and we've mentioned the name a bunch, Breathless. Just what do you guys think of the title? Because I hadn't thought about it while watching it, and even when we were talking about the movie right after having screened it, I didn't really consider the context of what we saw on screen versus what it was called. And I'm not going to try to pronounce the French title, but even the French words that are the name of the movie, I believe means like out of breath. So it's still the same kind of thing. And I don't know how I feel about that being the title of this narrative. I don't hate it, but I'm trying to think of what was going through their minds as they picked this as the name of the movie.
Do you have an interpretation?
Because I can only think of out of context, later year stuff, not, oh, hey, this is the name as we're releasing it now. Forget everything from 1961 to 2018.
I think the intention was just very literal because once again, like if you're worried about spoilers, you've had 60 years to watch this movie. Yeah. Sorry. But just the very ending, Michel is shot in the back after Patricia betrays him and tells the police where he's hiding. And he, runs down the street, like clutching his back and his bullet shot, and then he dies out of breath.
Actually, to back up what Hannah's discussing here, I did have another Godard quote. He's talking about on Michel particularly, he says, it expresses his fundamental moral sloth, his fatigue, his death drive. Mm-hmm. Nailed it. Yeah. I even wondered if it even went back. This is a more far-reaching interpretation.
What was that fatigue? Moral fatigue?
Moral sloth.
Even better.
His death drive. I love that. Totally. Throughout that whole movie, he's crazy destructive.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely what it is. I once again replaced the idea of once again going more autobiographic with Godard himself. I wonder, breathless, what does it mean in French? What do you say it was? Out of breath?
Out of breath.
Just out of breath. Yeah, I would assume.
Maybe it was just a lack of interest in what was already going on in the cinema as a whole. He's out of breath watching the same old kind of tried and true.
That makes sense for it being his debut. Yeah.
I mean, with the French New Wave, it goes back to kind of trying to tell more personal stories in a very stylized kind of way. And this is obviously something that has transferred through the films of today. I don't think you can watch this movie and not think of Quentin Tarantino or Wes Anderson. I think there's so many moments that, like these kind of filmmakers have obviously taken so many things from a film like Breathless.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about the American perspective, but trying to think about the French perspective a little bit as a 27-year-old American. This came out... This came out in 1960. In 1940 is when France surrendered to Germany and was under occupation. So it's 20 years since then, still another 4.5, 5 years of war, then rebuilding, political turmoil, financial turmoil, and then these guys mostly that were born a little bit before that happened, growing up with that and then trying to experience other things and seeing what life was like a little bit later, and even kind of being involved in Vietnam because that was a colony of France. Like the roots of that war started there. So there's like certain parallels to late 60s US versus early 60s, late 50s, minus like no occupation over here. But you can see, at least to me, like some parallels of, okay, this is what they were doing in 1960. Then we caught up 9-10 years later and had references of what to do. And then movies like Easy Rider can be coming out and have this like political, cultural, social, racial narrative just a little bit later in a slightly different context.
Well, that actually brings me up to another thought, what you're talking about. Renoir was obviously, we're talking about American movies that he was influenced by. Well, guess what? He was also heavily influenced by the cinema of France. And the things that preceded the French New Wave are filmmakers like Renoir, which, like something like The Grand Illusion or any of these kind of films, they're amazing, but they're a lot more, they seem almost kind of like American movies. There's no sign of kind of crazy, kind of stuff. After that would be kind of like the Cocteau, Beauty and the Beast. So I wonder if there was a sense of kind of what filmmaking could be. Those movies, if you ever seen those, they're like dreamy and surreal and really interesting. But then you bring up something like Easy Rider. Dennis Hopper discusses when he was making Easy Rider, he was trying to bring the French New Wave to the United States.
Right. Yeah, I love that. I hate that the United States was so far behind
Yeah.
But that's
when's Easy Rider?
69, I believe. So 9 years.
Just like Chris mentioned, yeah, it took
But it kind
a decade.
of makes sense too, because socially, like, the war wasn't really in full swing in 60 in the US, and there wasn't all this activism and craziness that happened later. So I think it makes sense that film was a little bit behind, because culturally and socially things were a little bit different here. And then we got there.
When we mentioned Alan Rene, why, even though he didn't identify with the French New Wave personally, why that makes sense to me now in a new way, why France would try to push him into that category, because all of his movies are about war through what could be considered a French New Wave lens. So So
if maybe some of the film techniques and things are a little bit different, just a little bit of the subject matter lends itself toward what was happening after him.
Yeah.
Well, and what's interesting about Breathless too is it's the easiest. It's certainly the easiest of all of his films to see. It's the one that reminds you the most of kind of an American kind of take on that. However, man, you get just a few years down the road, you get to some of these other movies, Godard himself becomes so unbelievably politically minded that you really would have to have a doctorate in like mythology to understand what he's exactly trying to talk about.
He definitely sacrifices those stories, I like, for the political. They're
done. Yeah. By the time The Weekend happens, which is kind of thought of as the end of his kind of, roly-poly, well, that's not the best way to say it, but the French New Wave kind of things. He, at the end of that movie, The Weekend, which is brutal. I like the movie, but it's like, I don't know what this taste is, but I don't need to see a pig get murdered. Anyways, at the end of that movie, it says, Death of Cinema. Mm-hmm. So he thought of that as the closing of that, never to be seen again. After that point, he went to just making kind of political, I'm Jean Luc Goddard, and this is what I think about this.
Kind of a cocky little man, isn't he?
Yeah.
I started cinema and I will finish.
Well, and Hannah will help me pronounce this movie. How do I say this movie?
Tout va bien.
Tout va bien, which does feature Jane Fonda, which going back to the Jean and Jane kind of thing, that's Hanoi Jane. It's all about, she's definitely making points about the war at Vietnam. So it's interesting how you're talking about, World War II. He eventually does catch up with Vietnam, and, he's just as active talking about the political climates of that time. So,
on that note, I feel like we should start to wind down.
Yeah.
But I have one little rambling thought that I want to at least finish my part off with. And that is just kind of French New Wave in general. Just having watched a little bit of it and then had this discussion, I can see why this film specifically, and then just kind of this movement of films, would be iconic and stick around. Because part of it was redefining what movies are. Because they'd only been around for a few decades, and they started off short, no sound. And this was advancing the medium, the way some people have done with music. Kind of similar time, like listening to like late 60s music versus the 40s. Very different.
Yeah.
What people are trying to do with like video games and VR and things. Like in modern day, they're trying to prove like, oh, hey, we can still tell narrative. It's not all just like jumping on stuff or shooting things. I can see that mixed in with this like indie vibe of, we're out of the studio. We don't know what we're doing really. We don't have everything. We're just kind of doing it and making it happen, and maybe not always legally doing it, but like we're just like making this movie. Like that, there's something about that spirit that I think resonates almost at any given time in history with somebody. And I want to watch more of these films now because of all of those reasons, and because Breathless is fantastic.
Well, and it goes back to kind of the auteur theory, like the filmmaker as author. Yeah. I would encourage anyone to watch the Godard movies from Breathless and just keep going. You would definitely walk away with a history of like, wow, that's an amazing movement that took place.
If you like Breathless, I think Band of Outsiders
awesome.
is a good next place to go. We mentioned Her Life to Live, vis-a-vis.
And if you'd like a taste even of just to kind of get to kind of when Godard kind of the rails he starts going off of then.
I was gesturing to you for the wacky stuff.
Yeah. Made in the USA. Don't ask me what it's about. I don't know if I can tell you. But boy, I like to see Marianne Faithfull sing. And I like to see Anna Karina. Is that
Karina?
Karina. Love her. So yeah, you can't go wrong watching the Godard kind of stuff. It's awesome. So cool.
Well, on that note, thank you for listening to us talk about and around Breathless and French New Wave. You can find us on social media at Lantern Cinema on Instagram and Twitter. We have a Facebook page. We have an email address.
Yeah, so if you just want to touch base and talk about movies, it's thelanterncinema@gmail.com.
If there's something we left out, please email us. We would love to shout you out.
I'm sure there's plenty.
Be kind. Hey, I think we did all right.
Because Michel is kind of 1960s internet troll, so we don't need 2018 internet troll.
Yeah. And I think we do need to ask, we need someone to conclusively let us know, did he actually pee in that sink? That needs to be discussed. We didn't talk about it, so if someone would let us know.
Tell us about the sink pee. Yeah. That's what I want all of you to know.
Should we say what our next film is going to be so we can...
Yes.
We'll loop back to it, yeah.
Okay.
We talked about it at the beginning, but on August 30th...
Right, August 30th, Vaudeville Muse. Please come check out in person if you're in Des Moines. Killing of a Chinese Bookie, the Cassavetes screening, along with Will Foley's Narcissus Paints. It's debut of his short film.
He's going to be awesome.
And okay.
Oh, good. So I was just going to say, if you also want to kind of get ahead of the game so you can watch the next movie we're going to be discussing, do you want to say what it's going to be?
I think you should do it.
Fellini's La Dolce Vita.
So we have a couple different roads here. If you want to see in person, check out some Cassavetes. That's fantastic. If you just want to check out the podcast and know what we're talking about next time, Dolce Vita is our next move.
Yep. So I guess that's it. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.